It was an evening like any other at La Lumière, the crown jewel of Beverly Hills dining. Sleek sports cars lined the entrance, and guests arrived in silk gowns and tailored suits, their presence an unspoken affirmation of their place in this exclusive world. Inside, the crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow, a reflection of elegance and extravagance at every corner. But then, the doors opened, and a towering figure stepped in. Dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, sweatpants, and worn sneakers, he moved with the ease of someone who wasn't here to impress. His presence immediately turned heads, not for his fame, but for how much he didn't belong. Whispers began to ripple across the tables as Shaquille O'Neal, the legendary basketball icon, made his way to a small table in the corner, deliberately avoiding attention. The staff at La Lumière were well-trained and catering to the city's elite. Yet, as Shaq settled into his seat, a waitress named Emma, poised at the reception desk, couldn't help but notice him. She scanned his casual attire, her expression betraying what she wouldn't say aloud. And then, with the precision of someone who thought she knew better, Emma approached him, her gaze sharp, her tone cutting. "Are you sure you can afford to dine here?" she said. Her words echoed just loud enough for the nearest diners to hear, carrying with them an unmistakable sense of judgment. What happened next would leave everyone in the restaurant stunned. The air seemed to change, and in that moment, the stage was set. Not for a simple dinner, but for a lesson no one in that room would forget. Shaquille O'Neal, unfazed by the sharp edge in Emma's words, met her gaze with a warm smile. His deep voice, steady and polite, broke the table. "Good evening," he said. "I'd like to book a table if there's one available." There was no sign of annoyance, no hint of retaliation, just a calm presence that contrasted starkly with the arrogance in Emma's demeanor. Her eyebrows rose slightly, the professionalism in her stance barely masking her disbelief. She hesitated, scanning him once more, and then, with a curt nod, motioned for him to follow. "Right this way," she said. Her tone clipped, but instead of seating him in the heart of the restaurant, where the chandeliers bathed the diners in golden light, she guided him to a dimly lit corner near the kitchen, a spot rarely offered to anyone, let alone a man of his stature. "This table should suit you just fine," Emma said, placing the menu down with a deliberate thud. Her smile, though professional, was tinged with condescension. Shaq simply nodded, thanked her, and took his seat, unbothered by the less-than-welcoming treatment. His composure left Emma visibly irritated. She lingered for a moment, hoping to provoke some reaction, but when none came, she turned and walked away, her steps firm and purposeful. But Emma wasn't finished. Moments later she returned, this time with a menu open to the restaurant's most luxurious dishes. She leaned slightly over the table, her tone light but laced with sarcasm. "The most expensive item here is $350, she said, pointing to a dish. "Are you sure you'd like to order that?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, her words loud enough for nearby diners to hear. Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't even look up at her. Instead, he studied the menu briefly, then looked her in the eye with the same calm expression. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, his tone as relaxed as if he were ordering a simple coffee. The response threw Emma off balance, if only for a moment. She smirked, but the edges of her confidence began to fray. "Oh, really?" she said, loud enough for others to hear. "I hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't the kind of food everyone is accustomed to." By now, the scene had caught the attention of the surrounding diners. Whispers began to circulate through the room. At one table, a young woman frowned and turned to her companion. "She's being so rude," she said under her breath. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Across the room, an older gentleman, distinguished with silver hair, sipped his wine and observed the exchange quietly. "He's impressively calm," he murmured to his wife. "Most people would have walked out by now." Shaq, meanwhile, remained a picture of composure. He smiled faintly, thanked Emma for her assistance, and resumed his quiet observation of the restaurant's lavish atmosphere. His relaxed demeanor stood in stark contrast to the growing unease among the other diners. Slowly, their attention shifted from Shaq's casual attire to the poise with which he carried himself. His quiet confidence began to command respect. even from those who had initially doubted him. Emma, however, seemed immune to the shift in the room's energy. From the service counter, she whispered to a colleague, her voice just loud enough for a few nearby patrons to catch snippets. "People like that," she said, glancing back at Shaq, "always pick the most expensive thing on the menu to show off. Let's see what happens when he gets the bill." The atmosphere in the restaurant was changing. While Emma continued her attempts to undermine him, the diners began to take notice, not just of her behavior, but of the unshakable grace with which Shaq endured it all. It was as though he understood something they didn't, as though he knew a truth that had yet to be revealed. Emma, still standing by the service counter, let her voice carry further than it should. "He probably doesn't even know what filet mignon Rossini is," she whispered to her colleague, but loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "People like him just try to make a statement. Let's see if he can even make it to dessert." Her laughter was subtle but sharp, her disdain growing more evident with every glance she cast toward Shaq's table. At this point, the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. The elegance and refinement La Lumiere prided itself on felt overshadowed by an undercurrent of discomfort. Patrons exchanged looks, their conversations punctuated by murmurs about the waitress who seemed to have taken it upon herself to mock a paying guest. At a corner table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, the distinguished older couple who had been quietly observing the scene, leaned closer to one another. Mrs. Carter's voice was a soft whisper. "Why is she treating him like that? He's done nothing but be polite." Mr. Carter took a measured sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving Shaq. "It's remarkable," he said. "He hasn't let any of this faze him. Grace under fire, that's something you don't see every day." Meanwhile, Shaq remained calm and composed, as if the weight of the room's attention didn't touch him. He skimmed the menu casually, his demeanor unshaken despite Emma's repeated attempts to undermine him. Other diners began to take notice, not just of Emma's rudeness, but of the quiet dignity with which Shaq handled it all. Sympathy and admiration started to ripple through the room. Emma, however, was oblivious. Her confidence only grew, fueled by her own sense of superiority. She continued her commentary to her colleagues, her voice still loud enough for others to hear. "I'd love to see his face when the bill arrives," she said with a smirk. "He's probably trying to impress someone, but this isn't the kind of place for show-offs." Then, as the tension in the room reached its peak, the moment came that no one, least of all Emma, expected. From across the restaurant, the manager emerged, a man known for his impeccable professionalism and discerning judgment. He walked directly to Shaq's table, his expression one of warm familiarity. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, his voice carrying an air of genuine respect. "It's an honor to have you here tonight. Thank you for choosing La Lumiere." The room fell silent, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to Shaq and the manager. Emma froze, her smirk vanishing in an instant. The realization washed over her face like a tidal wave. This was no ordinary guest. Shaq looked up, his calm smile still in place. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady and kind. "It's a pleasure to be here." The manager turned to Emma, who stood rooted to the spot, her composure unraveling. "Please ensure Mr. O'Neill has everything he needs," the manager said firmly, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. Emma nodded quickly, the arrogance she had worn so boldly now replaced by visible embarrassment. As the manager walked away, the room remained quiet, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. Shaq's unshakable grace had not only highlighted Emma's misjudgment, but had also reminded everyone in the room of something far greater. Respect and humility transcend appearances. The tension in the room melted into a quiet reverence. Mr. Carter raised his glass once more, this time in a silent toast to the man who had shown that true strength lies in restraint. Emma, meanwhile, moved about the restaurant with a humbled demeanor, her earlier confidence replaced with something more subdued. Shaquille O'Neal's quiet dignity left a lasting impression on everyone in the restaurant that night. And as the story of what happened at La Lumiere would eventually make its way beyond those walls, it served as a powerful reminder. Grace and humility will always outweigh arrogance and prejudice. If stories like this inspire you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable moments and lessons that matter.